The Midnight Caller. Lily Thompson had always been a cautious person. Living alone in her small suburban house, she made sure to lock every door and window each night before going to bed. She enjoyed her quiet, predictable life, working at the local library by day and curling up with a good book in the evenings. One rainy night, as she was settling into bed, her phone rang. It was unusual for anyone to call her so late. She glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. With a sigh, she picked up the phone and answered. "Hello?" There was no response, just silence. Then she heard it, a faint, raspy breathing on the other end. Her heart pounded as she listened, waiting for the caller to speak. But they didn't. After a few moments, she hung up, her hands shaking. Trying to calm herself, she reasoned it must have been a prank call. She set her phone on the nightstand and turned off the light. But as she lay there in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The next night, the phone rang again at the same time. 11:45 p.m. Lily's stomach twisted with dread as she answered. "Hello?" Again, there was silence, followed by the same raspy breathing. This time, she mustered the courage to speak. "Who is this? What do you want?" No answer, just breathing. She hung up, feeling a chill run down her spine. She decided to call her friend Emily, who lived nearby. "Emily, I'm getting these creepy phone calls late at night. Someone just breathes into the phone and doesn't say anything. It's really freaking me out." Emily tried to reassure her. "It's probably just some jerk trying to scare you. If it happens again, maybe you should call the police." Lily agreed, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, she barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of who could be behind the calls. The following evening, Lily made sure all her doors and windows were locked. She even checked the back door twice. At 11:45 p.m., the phone rang again. Her heart pounded as she answered, her voice trembling. "Hello?" The breathing was louder this time, more pronounced. She felt a surge of anger and fear. "Stop calling me. I'm calling the police." Suddenly, the line went dead. She stared at the phone, her heart racing. She dialed 911 and reported the calls. The operator assured her they would send a patrol car to her neighborhood. Lily stayed up waiting for the police. Around midnight, there was a knock at the door. She jumped, but then she saw the police cars flashing lights outside. She opened the door to find Officer Davis standing on her porch. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm here to check on you. We received your call about the strange phone calls." Lily explained everything to him. He took notes and assured her they would keep an eye on her house. Before he left, he gave her his card. "Call me if you receive any more of these calls." Lily thanked him and went back inside, feeling slightly better. But the relief was short-lived. The calls continued, night after night, always at 11:45 p.m. Each time the breathing seemed closer, more menacing. One night, after yet another call, she decided to unplug her phone before bed. She hoped that would put an end to the harassment. As she lay in bed, she finally began to relax, thinking she had outsmarted the caller. But then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of her front door creaking open. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had locked the door. She was sure of it. Heart pounding, she reached for her phone to call Officer Davis, but then remembered she had unplugged it. Panic set in as she heard footsteps in the hallway. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept under her bed and crept towards the door, trying to be as quiet as possible. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She could hear the breathing now, the same raspy sound from the phone calls. Suddenly, the door to her bedroom swung open. She swung the bat with all her might, but it was knocked out of her hands. She screamed as a figure loomed over her, shadowed and menacing. In the dim light, she could see a twisted, malevolent grin on the intruder's face. He grabbed her by the throat, his grip like iron. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but he was too strong. The last thing she saw before she blacked out was his eyes, cold, dark, and filled with malice. Lily woke up in darkness, her head throbbing. She was bound to a chair, her wrists and ankles tied with rough rope. She tried to scream, but a gag muffled her cries. Panic surged through her as she looked around, trying to make sense of her surroundings. She was in a basement, dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb. The walls were damp and covered in mold. In front of her stood the man, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He watched her with a chilling calmness. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been watching you for a long time, Lily." Terror gripped her as she realized this wasn't a random intruder. He had been stalking her, learning her routines, waiting for the right moment. "Why are you doing this?" she managed to say through the gag. He stepped closer, his grin widening. "Because I can. Because it's fun. And because no one can save you now." Lily's heart sank as she realized the hopelessness of her situation. She was alone, trapped, and at the mercy of a madman. Desperation gave her strength, and she began to struggle against the ropes, but they only tightened, cutting into her skin. He laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "There's no point in struggling. No one is coming for you. You're mine now." As the days passed, Lily endured unimaginable torment. The man seemed to take pleasure in her suffering, watching her with sadistic delight. She lost track of time, her world reduced to the dark, damp basement and the pain he inflicted upon her. One night, after what felt like an eternity, she heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Hope flickered within her, but the man only laughed. "They're not coming for you," he said. "They'll never find you." But then, the door to the basement burst open, and Officer Davis rushed in, his gun drawn. The man tried to flee, but Davis tackled him to the ground, handcuffing him. "Lily, are you all right?" Davis asked, rushing to her side and removing the gag. Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered. Davis called for backup, and soon the basement was filled with police officers. They took the man away, and Lily was finally free. She was taken to the hospital, where she began the long process of healing both physically and emotionally. Months passed, and Lily tried to rebuild her life, but the scars of her ordeal ran deep. She moved to a new city, changed her phone number, and tried to forget. But every night as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. One evening, as she was settling into her new apartment, her phone rang. She froze, staring at the clock. 11:45 p.m. With trembling hands, she answered, "Hello?" Silence. Then the same raspy breathing. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "It can't be." But it was. The nightmare wasn't over. The man had found her again, and this time there would be no escape. The Diary of Shadows. Emma was an ordinary girl living in a small town. She worked as a librarian, loved reading, and enjoyed a quiet life. Her days were routine, filled with the familiar comfort of books and the occasional chat with regular library visitors. One day, as Emma was sorting through a pile of old books donated to the library, she found a leather-bound diary. It looked ancient, with yellowed pages and a worn cover. There was no name on it, just a date, 1923. Curiosity piqued, she decided to take it home to read. That evening, Emma settled into her cozy armchair, opened the diary, and began to read. The handwriting was elegant, but somewhat faded. The diary belonged to a woman named Lillian. As Emma read, she was drawn into Lillian's world, her hopes, dreams, and fears. At first, the diary entries were mundane, detailing Lillian's daily life and thoughts. But as Emma read on, the entries became darker. Lillian wrote about strange occurrences in her home, a large old mansion on the outskirts of town. She described hearing whispers at night, seeing shadows move in the corners of her vision, and feeling an icy presence in her room. Emma felt a chill as she read Lillian's words. The descriptions were so vivid, so real. She could almost hear the whispers and see the shadows herself. One entry stood out. It was dated October 31st, 1923. "Something is wrong. The shadows are growing darker and the whispers louder. I fear I'm not alone in this house. I found a hidden room today, behind the bookcase in the library. Inside there was a mirror covered in dust. When I wiped it clean, I saw not my reflection, but a dark figure standing behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. I am terrified. I don't know what to do." Emma shivered and closed the diary. She couldn't read anymore that night. She placed it on her bedside table and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to Lillian's words. The next day at the library, Emma couldn't stop thinking about the diary. She decided to do some research on Lillian and the mansion. She discovered that the mansion had been abandoned for decades. There were rumors of it being haunted, but no one seemed to know what had happened to Lillian. Emma felt a strange compulsion to visit the mansion. She wanted to see it for herself, to understand what Lillian had experienced. After work, she drove to the outskirts of town and found the mansion. It was a large, imposing structure, with broken windows and ivy-covered walls. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. She walked up to the front door, which creaked open with a push. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Emma's footsteps echoed through the empty halls. She found the library easily. It was just as Lillian had described, with tall bookshelves and a large ornate bookcase in the corner. Emma approached the bookcase and pulled at the books. One of them came loose, and the bookcase swung open, revealing a hidden room. Inside was a mirror, covered in dust, just as Lillian had written. Taking a deep breath, Emma wiped the dust from the mirror. At first, she saw only her reflection, but then, slowly, a dark figure began to appear behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Fear gripped her, but she was determined to understand what had happened to Lillian. She went back to the diary and read the final entries. Lillian wrote about how the dark figure in the mirror began to haunt her dreams, whispering to her, filling her mind with terror. She felt trapped in her own home, unable to escape the presence that lurked in the shadows. Emma realized she was now experiencing the same haunting as Lillian. She felt the icy presence in her own home, heard the whispers at night, and saw the shadows move in the corners of her vision. Desperate for answers, Emma sought out an old woman named Margaret, who was said to know the history of the town and its secrets. Margaret listened as Emma recounted her experiences and showed her the diary. Margaret's face grew pale as she read Lillian's words. She explained that the mansion had once been owned by a man named Samuel, who was obsessed with the occult. He had conducted dark rituals in the hidden room, trying to summon spirits and gain power over life and death. One night, something had gone terribly wrong, and Samuel had disappeared, leaving behind a curse on the mansion. Margaret warned Emma to stay away from the mansion, but Emma felt she had to go back. She needed to end the haunting, for Lillian and for herself. Armed with a flashlight and a sense of determination, Emma returned to the mansion that night. The air was colder and the whispers louder. She went straight to the hidden room and stood before the mirror. The dark figure appeared almost instantly, its shadowy form growing clearer. Emma spoke to it, demanding to know what it wanted. The figure's whisper filled her mind, a chilling voice that spoke of Samuel's unfinished ritual and the need for a soul to complete it. Fear surged through Emma, but she refused to back down. She took the diary and began to read aloud Lillian's final entry, calling on the spirit to release her and end the curse. The shadows grew thicker, swirling around her, the whispering deafening. Suddenly the mirror shattered, and the dark figure let out a terrible scream. The shadows dissipated and the room fell silent. Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders, and she knew the curse was broken. She left the mansion, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Lillian's spirit was free, but the experience had changed Emma. She could never forget the terror she had faced. Years later, the mansion was demolished, and a new building was erected in its place. But Emma never returned to that part of town. She lived the rest of her life with a sense of unease, always aware of the shadows that seemed to linger just out of sight. The Silent Forest. Sarah had always loved hiking. The peace and solitude of the woods offered her an escape from the daily grind of city life. So when she heard about the Silent Forest, a remote and unexplored stretch of wilderness, she couldn't resist the temptation. It was said to be beautiful, untouched by humans, and full of wildlife. She packed her gear, eager for an adventure, and set out early one morning. The drive was long, taking her deep into the countryside. As she approached the forest, she noticed there were no other cars on the road. The locals had warned her to stay away, telling tales of people who had entered the forest and never returned. but Sarah dismissed these as mere superstitions. The entrance to the silent forest was marked by a simple wooden sign, weathered and almost unreadable. She parked her car, grabbed her backpack, and started down the narrow path. The forest was indeed beautiful. Tall trees towered above her, their leaves forming a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight. The air was cool and fresh, filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. For the first few hours, Sarah enjoyed herself immensely. She took pictures, marveled at the scenery, and felt at peace. But as the day wore on, the atmosphere began to change. The forest grew denser, the trees thicker, and the path narrower. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Sarah pressed on, determined to explore further. As she walked, she noticed strange markings on the trees, deep, claw-like gouges that seemed too large to be made by any animal she knew. The air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over her. She decided to turn back, but the path she had taken seemed to have vanished. Panic set in as she realized she was lost. She checked her phone, but there was no signal. Trying to stay calm, she retraced her steps, but every direction looked the same. The trees seemed to close in around her, and the silence became oppressive. As night fell, Sarah found herself in a small clearing. She set up her tent and built a fire, hoping the light would keep any wild animals at bay. She tried to eat, but her fear had killed her appetite. Exhausted, she crawled into her tent and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside sent her heart racing. The forest felt alive, watching her, waiting. Hours passed, and just as she began to drift off, she heard it. A faint, distant whisper. She froze, listening intently. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, but she couldn't make out the words. Terrified, she grabbed her flashlight and unzipped the tent. She shone the light around the clearing, but saw nothing. The whispering stopped. She sat there, flashlight in hand, until dawn. With the first light of morning, she packed up her camp and resumed her search for the way out. Her fear had given way to determination. She had to find her way back. But the forest seemed to twist and turn, leading her deeper instead of out. As the day wore on, she stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, but she was desperate for any sign of human presence. She approached cautiously, pushing open the creaky door. The inside was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and dust. She found an old journal on a rickety table, its pages yellowed with age. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas, who had lived in the cabin years ago. He wrote of strange occurrences in the forest, disappearances, unnatural sounds, and shadows that moved on their own. The last entry was particularly chilling. "They are coming. I can hear them whispering. There is no escape." Sarah's hands trembled as she read. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the cabin. She dropped the journal and ran outside, but the whispering followed her. It was all around her, growing louder and more insistent. She ran blindly through the forest, branches scratching her arms and face. The whispering was deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere. She tripped and fell, her flashlight rolling away. In the darkness, she saw them, shadowy figures emerging from the trees, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Sarah screamed and tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't move. The figures surrounded her, their whispers filling her mind. She felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and everything went black. Days later, a search party found her abandoned car at the edge of the silent forest. Despite an extensive search, no trace of Sarah was ever found. The locals shook their heads and muttered about the curse of the forest. Years passed, and the silent forest remained undisturbed, its secrets hidden within its depths. But sometimes, on quiet nights, hikers reported hearing faint whispers on the wind, calling them deeper into the woods. And those who ventured too far were never seen again.